Just in March of this year, we had a wonderful piece of evidence come up from Senator Carl Levin's minority report to the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and it was a report on correspondent banks and money laundering. Now, this is a story from the Washington Post dated February 5th. It says, inattention and disinterest by U.S. banks in screening the foreign banks they take as clients has allowed rogue foreign banks, not rogue, and their criminal clients to carry on money laundering and other criminal activity in the United States and to benefit from the protections afforded by the safety and the soundness of the U.S. banking industry, said Senator Carl Levin of Michigan. Specifically mentions J.P. Morgan Chase. On the next page, 4,000 offshore banks to launder money into the United States, $1 trillion laundered annually. That's conservative. Money laundered in which the Clinton administration declared a national security threat. Not true. It's a national asset as far as Wall Street is concerned. Carl Levin said $500 billion moved through the U.S. banking system in drug money every year. That's liquid cash. And you want to know how important liquid cash in this world? There's a saying. One of my dear friends and colleagues and mentors, Catherine Austin Fitz, is a former Assistant Secretary of Housing. She was a managing director of Dillon Reed on Wall Street. She says cash flow is everything. And in an economy that's on the verge of a major implosion, without cash flow, the crash is guaranteed. Now, CIA's role is to make sure that as much of that drug money comes through the U.S. economy as possible.
When I was a little girl, I grew up at 48th and Larchwood in West Philadelphia, and the Solari index was 100%. The Solari index is the index that I use to describe the well-being of a neighborhood. It's the percent of people in a neighborhood who believe that a child can leave their home, go to the nearest place to buy a popsicle, and come home alone safely. It was unthinkable that a child wasn't safe at 48th and Larchwood in West Philadelphia in the 1950s. The Solari index was 100%, and the Dow Jones index was probably about 500. Today, it's reversed. The Dow Jones index is very high at about 10,000, and the Solari index is at very low in West Philadelphia and very low throughout the United States. And why is that? It's because one of the ways that we finance the growth of multinational corporations and big banks and the rise of the Dow Jones is by selling narcotics to our children. It's one of the most profitable businesses in America. About a year ago, I gave a speech called How the Money Works in Organized Crime to a wonderful group of people in Philadelphia. They have a conference every year. They go off into the woods for about 3 days and talk about how they can help our culture, our world, spiritually evolve. So I gave my presentation on how the money works with organized crime, describing what is arguably the biggest, most profitable industry in the United States today. And towards the end, we were discussing the fact that the Department of Justice estimates that the United States is the leader in laundering organized crime profits of about $500 billion to $1 trillion a year. So I asked the audience, what would happen if we stopped being the worldwide leader in laundering $500 billion to $1 trillion a year? And they said, well, you know, if we stopped, our mutual funds would go down in price, the stock market would crash. I said, well, what else would happen? So they said, well, you know, we might have trouble financing the government deficit because, in fact, the people who control 50 years of accumulated profits, that's a lot of capital that we need to finance our deficit. So I said, okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's pretend there's a big red button right up here in the lectern right in front of me. And if you push that button, you can stop all organized crime in America, and you can stop America laundering $500 billion to $1 trillion of organized crime profits every year. Who here will push the button? And out of 100 people, only one person would push the button. And I said, okay, so what you're saying is you want a whole armada of people to sell drugs to your children and grandchildren to keep your mutual funds up and your government checks coming. And they said, Yes, that's right. Now, there are many ways to change that. There are many ways to re-engineer our financial system and our resources so that the Solari Index and the Dow Jones can be friends. So that when we get the Solari Index to go up by making sure our neighborhoods are safe for children, the real estate can go up in value, the small businesses go up in value. There are many ways to make the Solari Index and the Dow Jones friends. But before we can do that, before we can have that conversation, we have to face what's happening. We have to face that we are addicted to drug profits, because if we can't face it, God can't fix it.
Okay. This is a copy of the cover sheet of the report. It's on the World Wide Web. If you want to go search for it, you can just look for the report on correspondent banking. Okay, and that's a copy of the report. It's an incredible read. What they don't tell you in there, of course, is that the U.S. economy is dependent upon that drug money, among other things. Now let's go a little further. Gotta love this. If this gentleman down here in the black jacket walks into a bank with a deposit of $10,001, does everybody understand that the bank has to fill out a report and send it to the U.S. Treasury indicating that he might be a money launderer? But did you happen to know that under U.S. laws, there are certain classes of business that are exempt from making currency transaction reports? Included in those are a bank, obviously, a department or agency of the U.S. government. CIA does not have to fill out currency transaction reports. An entity established under the laws of any state, but you come down to this one. A listed entity other than a bank whose common or analogous equity interests are listed on the New York Stock Exchange or American Stock Exchange, or designated as a NASDAQ national market security. If you have a company that trades on Wall Street, you can launder all the money you want to. It's legal. Gee. Now, I'm just laying a little groundwork here for you before we get to September 11th. We're getting there. Just last year, a group of companies were called in to meet with Janet Reno, who's not probably the most ethical person that ever lived, and Secretary of State Deputy Treasury Secretary Stuart Eisenstadt. And these companies, Hewlett-Packard, Ford, Sony, General Motors, Whirlpool, General Electric, and Philip Morris, were called in to the Department of Justice for the amount of drug money they were laundering. Basically, the message was, you guys cool it. Okay? It's getting, like, out of hand. Now, let me ask a question. This gentleman right here, what's your name?
Kevin.
Kevin. Kevin is a drug lord. Kevin is the king of all drugs in South America. Okay? All right. And let's say this young lady right down here with the glasses. What's your name? Rhonda. Rhonda is the executive vice president of General Motors for the Southern Hemisphere, or South America. Okay? Kevin, you call up Rhonda one day and you say, I'd like 100 Chevy Suburbans, armor-plated, custom-built, at $30,000 each, and I'll pay cash. Rhonda, what are you going to say to that offer? All right. All right. Now, Kevin's got money that he can't spend because it's drug money. But now he's got 100 Chevy Suburbans. But let's say now that, gentleman with his hand on his chin right there. Yeah, right there. What's your name? No, you. What's your name? Brian. Brian is Jack Welch, the chairman of General Electric. Okay? Now, Kevin, you're really good. Okay? You got $200 million that you got to move. Okay? So you call up Jack Welch's assistant, special accounts assistant. You say, I'd like to open in South America Kevin's Appliances. I'd like to buy $200 million of everything GE has, because I'm going to open this appliance store and I'll pay you cash. Now, Jack Welch at GE, what do you say? Right on. Let's do this deal. Now, by the way, who owns NBC? General Electric. MSNBC, CNBC, all the NBCs. Okay? Now, let's just take a look at that for one quick second. Very quickly, a price-to-earnings ratio, P to E, market capitalization. It's very simple. If you have a company that has 10,000 shares, and each share sells for $10, did I say 1,000 shares? 1,000 shares, $10. Your market capitalization is $10,000. You multiply the share price by the number of shares. Market capitalization. You divide that by net profits. In other words, what you sell less the cost of doing business, and you come up with a ratio. This is how they value the stock market. Okay, so if you have a company that has a $300 million market capitalization and a $10 million net profit, the price to earnings is 30. The POP is 30. And that's about right. And by the way, the current Dow Jones Industrial Average is overpriced by about 2/3. Okay? Now, if you have this 30-to-1 ratio, if I add another $1 million, my pen went dry. If I add another $1 million and make that 2, what happens to this number? Becomes 60. All right? Now, the lady in red down here who's looking away from me. Ma'am, what's your name? Karen. Karen owns an orange juice company. Makes the best orange juice in the world. And I owe all of what I'm teaching you now to Catherine Austin Fitz. And she has a wonderful website at solari.com, and we'll put those up before I leave. You make incredible orange juice. Okay, the best orange juice in the world. It's fairly priced. Karen's orange juice, right? Okay. You have $1 million net profit a year. Now, let's say this young lady down here in the glasses with the light green sweater. What's your name? That's you. What's your name? Chris. Chris is the chief executive officer of PepsiCo, which owns a small orange juice company called Tropicana. Okay? You see her company with $1 million in net profit. How much, and your price to earnings is 30-to-1. How much are you willing to pay for that? How much are you willing to pay for her company? Would you pay $29 million? Yeah, because the minute you bought her company for $29 million, your stock value goes up $30 million. How do Wall Street executives get paid? In stock. And you watch very closely the Bush administration's plan for economic recovery. It's all handouts to the corporation, which will go directly to boost their POP, which will put hundreds of millions of dollars in the pockets of executives. Has anybody noticed the Bush administration has not offered one single aid plan for any unemployed airline worker? All right, let's get down and dirty here. Oh, one more thing. Remember that guy John Deutsch that I had fun with? Okay. Well, right now he's on the board of directors of Citibank, along with the former executive director of the CIA, who is not on the board, but she's a very highly placed executive, Nora Slatkin. John Deutsch, of course, is as crooked as the rest of them. Also on the board of Citibank is a guy named Robert Rubin, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. Yes, thank you. He deserves all the hisses he can get. Well, in May of this year, Citibank announced a $12 billion cash purchase of a Mexican bank called Banamex. Second largest bank in Mexico, also a documented, and I mean documented, drug money laundering bank that was exposed in a Mexican newspaper. Roberto Hernandez, this is him, gets a seat on Citibank's board of directors, and yet this is what's going on his property. He owns thousands of acres near Cancun in Mexico. The locals call it the Cocaine Peninsula. There's hundreds of photographs. He lost 2 lawsuits in Mexico. And then my friend Al Giordano, who publishes a great website called www.narconews.com, wrote a great story about the Mexican paper stories, and Hernandez sued Giordano in New York, and he's going to lose that lawsuit, by the way. Al Giordano's a brave journalist. But the point I'm making with this is that the criminality had gotten so out of hand by May of this year that Citibank would openly buy a known drug money laundering bank and put the drug money launderer on its board of directors. That's the need for drug cash in the U.S. economy right now. By the way, Citibank's record of involvement in drug money laundering is extremely well documented in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. It laundered some, I think, $300 or $400 million for Raul Salinas de Gortari, the brother of the former Mexican president. Now let's go to some other things that are going on in the economy so that we set you up to understand what's going on around September the 11th. The U.S. economy is being looted. Anybody here remember the savings and loan scandal? You know, the gang that's in the White House is the same gang that brought us the savings and loan scandal? That took $500 billion out of your pockets. Well, here's some new developments in the government. And by the way, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. Bill Clinton's a sleazebag too. Okay? That so-called liberal put almost a million nonviolent drug offenders in prison to boost the shares of companies like Corrections Corporation of America and Wackenhut. He destroyed many of the welfare laws, and one is not better than the other. But notice this: HUD loses, HUD, Housing and Urban Development, $59 billion. When was the last time you lost $59 billion? This was from testimony in Congress by Susan. And you know what HUD said they did when they couldn't figure out where the money went? We made an adjustment in our checkbook. Where's that money going? You'll find out before we're through. Now, if you thought that was bad, the Defense Department cannot account for $1.1 trillion that seems to have vanished within the tangled system of financial accounting put in place by private contractors. Do you know who the private contractors are? Lockheed Martin and DynCorp. Okay? HUD. Oh, I dropped a microphone. I have more microphones on me than the FBI has in my living room. This is from a very great reporter, a very courageous woman who had served on Capitol Hill for many years and became an investigative reporter named Kelly O'Meara, who writes for the Washington Times Insight magazine. I know it's owned by Moon, but Kelly does fabulous work, and she's written a great piece on civil rights after the September 11th attack. The point is that $4.4 trillion in adjustments to the Pentagon books had to be cooked to compile the required financial statements, and that $1.1 trillion of that amount could not be supported by any reliable information. All right, now, there's one thing I got to do before we get to September the 11th and what's happening since. It's easy to say that this is a war about oil, and you're going to know more about it than you did when you came in here when you leave. The entire world economy is on the brink of a major collapse. 2 days before the attacks on the World Trade Center, I issued an emergency bulletin to all of my subscribers. And by the way, there's a table over here, and those of you who would like to subscribe, we have the information there for you. I'll put a website up. We also have videotapes of a lecture on Wall Street's War for Drug Money, which is like 2 hours on what I did with the economy, that I gave at the USC School of International Relations last December, and we have those tapes over there. I think Chris Milligan's over there somewhere. Chris, wherever you are. But I issued a bulletin saying that we were on the brink of an economic collapse that would make 1929 look like a picnic. And in the 3 weeks prior to the attacks, the Dow had dropped almost 900 points. Now, what we have seen since then, and you must understand this clearly, is that the Dow's so-called resurrection to close to 10,000 points is strictly the result of a massive infusion of cash from the U.S. Treasury, which is your cash, which is being given to the corporate executives and not to the people who have been laid off. And every time you see the Dow go up, you'd better believe that another 5,000, 10,000 people have lost their jobs.
We are also in a global financial crisis that began in 1998 with the collapse of the bond markets and hedge fund derivatives, the money laundering investigations, and the mega mergers in the financial industry. The war buildup after September 11th is now shifting resources from domestic needs to the defense establishment. This fulfills a Bush-Cheney campaign promise to boost defense spending.
But it is not sustainable for a number of reasons. And then this brings us into the issue of oil briefly, and we'll get into this more later. And basically is that oil production in the world is peaking. The last untapped major oil fields in the world are in two places, actually. First, Central Asia, and we'll get into that in depth. And second, guess where? In Colombia. Okay? And this is now a war, and this is now a moment in human history when the age of oil is nearing its end, because world population and demand will exceed production.